Well, hello, everyone. My name is Heidi Christensen, and I am with the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we are so very glad that you have joined us today for today's webinar presentation, Do I Need This Pill? Understanding Pain and Prescription Drugs, with our guest presenter, Dr. David Thomas of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, otherwise known as NIDA. Today's webinar is part of a series of educational webinars that the HHS Partnership Center has produced over the last year, which are designed especially for faith and community leaders about the opioid epidemic. Enlisting subject matter experts from HHS, we have talked about opioids, the science of addiction, treatment, the long road to recovery, and today the important topic of pain and prescription drugs. Now, don't worry if you missed any of those educational opportunities. In a follow-up email to today's program, we will be sending the recording of today's webinar, a link to the practical toolkit for faith and community leaders, as well as links to our 2017 educational webinars and a live stream event to all those who registered for today's program. Now, the HHS Partnership Center, as we're known, works to support faith and community health leaders with timely information, best practice sharing, and resources that we hope will strengthen the capacity of faith and community leaders to address public health issues and public health crises such as the opioid crisis that we'll discuss today. We hope this next hour with Dr. Thomas will be helpful to you and your community as we explore how pain works, how opioids work to address pain, and the science behind their addictive properties. But a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This is an educational webinar off the record and not intended for press purposes. If you are a member of the press, please disconnect and we will be happy to connect you to the press office here at HHS after the program. And we welcome your questions and comments throughout today's webinar. We'll take a break about midway in the program, and then at the end of Dr. Thomas's presentation to take questions. Now, you should see a control panel on your screen with a text box in the lower right-hand corner. Please use that box to type in your questions or comments throughout the webinar. Now, my colleague here at the Partnership Center, Ben O'Dell, will be monitoring that chat box and queuing and asking the questions at the Q&A breaks. So what we'd like to do, and you should be ready if you've been on a previous center webinar, is to have you practice using that chat box by letting our presenter know where you are listening in from. So please now type in that chat box and tell us what city or town and state you are listening in from. All right, I see West Hartford, Raleigh, North Carolina, Dallas, Chicago's in the house, Camden, New Jersey, Knoxville, Tennessee, Alexandria, Virginia, local. Oh, and good morning, San Bernardino. Thank you for joining us at the start of your day. Okay, great, terrific. So it looks to me like we may actually have all 50 states in the house. Thank you so much. We are so glad you are all with us. Now, okay, that's the box for your questions and comments throughout the hour. We look forward to hearing from you. Also, if anyone is having difficulty with their audio, you may find it helpful to call the number on your screen rather than listen through your computer. Sometimes that just works better for sound quality on this platform. And as a final note and a reminder, we will be emailing a link to the recording of today's presentation to all those who registered for this webinar. The current opioid epidemic is a priority for HHS and our nation for good reason. Since the year 2000, more than 300,000 Americans have died of an opioid overdose. Preliminary data for 2016 indicates that we will see at least 64,000 drug overdose deaths, the highest number ever recorded in the United States. Whether for acute or chronic pain, poor or misinformed pain treatment is a contributing factor to today's opioid crisis. An estimated 25 million Americans experience daily pain that for many of them interferes with essential aspects of their lives, including their physical and mental health, work productivity, and the ability to engage in social activities. Today we will explore the history and nature of pain, how opioids work to relieve pain, and the issues surrounding prescription pain relief and misuse, including an illuminating presentation on the brain science of addiction. Now, here to put these often complex information into language and concepts that non-professionals like me can understand is the plainest spoken scientist I've ever had the honor to meet, Dr. David Thomas. Dr. Thomas is a health scientist administrator for NIDA, which is a component of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. NIDA supports most of the world's research on the health aspects of drug use and addiction. And after 12 years as a pain and opioid researcher, Dr. Thomas joined NIDA, where he manages much of the Institute's pain and opioid research efforts. He is currently chair of NIDA's Prescription Opioids and Pain Work Group, and he is a founding member of the NIH Pain Consortium. I also want to note that Dr. Thomas brings his expertise to many of the interagency working groups where I first met him, including those focused on behavioral health, provider education, and of course the National Pain Strategy. He is the lead on the NIH Pain Consortium Centers of Excellence in Pain Education, and in between these notable responsibilities, he is a researcher out in the community. In the last month, I saw him at Howard University, and then I think it was CNN last week. So Dr. Thomas, David, thanks you so much for taking the time out of your overwhelming schedule to be with us today. We are so very eager to hear from you, and I think Ben has been able to turn the presentation over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. That was a great introduction. Let me see if I can share my monitor. Are you seeing the correct slide now with my introduction?
We are.
Oh, awesome. So thanks for the introduction, Heidi. That was really nice. I've never been heard or been described as such a plain speaker, but that's good, because I really think that it's important to boil things down to their essence. I like watching Judge Judy, who gets right to the point, and I think right now it can get confusing with this opioid and pain crisis, and that if we can step back and look at what's really going on this more simpler level, I think that it kind of comes into a little better focus. So yeah, so I'm Dave Thomas. I'm at the National Institute of Health. At that Howard University meeting that Heidi referred to, they had a panel with 4 clergy on the stage talking about the faith-based community, how it can be accessed, used, and help support better treatment of pain and trying to fight this opioid crisis. And it really, a light bulb went off on my head, because first, I'm aware of the fact that a lot of faith-based sort of efforts can be very powerful in drug abuse, the 12-step program, and just seeing yourself as part of something bigger, and then the network, the churches, the synagogues, and all the places of worship where you can reach out to the community, and the community can reach out even further to their families and friends. So I really think that in this crisis, we need part of it is us in our government offices doing stuff, but a lot of it's going to be at the grassroots community level. And so it's a real honor and privilege to be able to speak to you guys today. I first want to say I have nothing to disclose, except that I care. I'm at NIDA. We care about the opioid crisis, but I also care about people in pain. And I don't think those should in any way be mutually exclusive. In fact, I think they go together very well. So as Heidi said, I'm going to give you a little overview of pain, how it works, and opioids and how they work. And I'm going to start back at the beginning. I mean, this slide you're looking at here on the left is a diagram from Descartes from about 1600. And this was it's very simple. It's used a lot to explain pain. And it has a lot that's true about it, but it's also not true anymore. But this just shows somebody sticking their foot near a hot fire, and then they have a nerve fiber that goes up the spinal cord into the brain. And the idea there is that the fire activates something in the foot that sends a message. I think they thought it was hydraulic. It's electric, we know now, but sends it to the brain, and then the brain gets a one-to-one correspondence. It's called label line, but it represents the fire in the brain and tells you you're stepping in fire. That's not quite true. I mean, part of it is true. You do have nerves that send electrical signals to the brain, tell you you're in pain, but it's not just what's out there gets relayed to the brain. And so if there's a small fire, you feel a little bit of heat. If there's a big fire, you feel a lot of heat. There's all sorts of processing that goes along the way. And this is what I'm going to try to describe. Now, a lot of this came about with something of a renaissance in the 60s. We started to understand that pain is not just pain. Pain gets processed, it gets changed, it gets manipulated by the brain, by the spinal cord. The first major advance was the gate control theory. I have a gate here from Melzack and Wall in the early 60s. And what they found was that if you touch something hot, or if you have a painful sensation that's coming up your nerve to your spinal cord, that right as soon as it gets into your body, as soon as you react to the pain, there's this something of a gate where other nerves come back and can either inhibit it or make it more painful, kind of hyperalgesia when things hurt more. And this gating system, as they call it, the gate control theory, was used to explain how in some points in time you might not feel a lot of pain when a person looks like they should, or do feel a lot of pain when it looks like, based on injury or what they're interacting with, shouldn't feel pain. And the simplest example of the gate control theory that you've probably experienced is that if you have, say, a swollen hand or a joint that hurts, people often rub them. They just rub it and it feels better. And why does that happen? Well, when you rub your hand, you activate fibers that respond to touch. And touch fibers can come back and inhibit or turn off, or at least lessen the firing of pain fibers. So that is a very simple processing that happens in your periphery, but can explain some of the fact that pain is not pain. Pain gets processed and changed. Then the 70s were really cool, early 70s. Hughes and Colister, they were doing research where they studied pigs and blood of pigs, and they were finding these chemicals in the blood that they weren't quite sure what they were, and they were trying, and they didn't have great technologies to figure out what chemicals were at that point in time. Like we have today, we're much better at that, but they were finding these unusual chemicals, and finally, through various techniques like binding studies and things, they were able to identify these chemicals as endorphins. Now, you've probably heard about in the press, it was big news for years and years, but that was a shocking thing at the time, that we have in our body endorphins. And endorphins are basically opioids, like morphine. We have our own morphine in our bodies. It's like, why is it there? And that's what the research has been going on for the last 40 years, is trying to understand, a lot of pain researchers, how to understand this system better. But what they also recognize is that the endorphins in your brain and in your spinal cord and in your body, they were kind of like a key. They were meant to attach to something and make it happen. So that led to the big question of, where's the lock? I mean, you have the keys floating around. They're supposed to unlock something. And what Solomon Snyder and Candace Pert found out soon after the discovery of the key is they found the lock. They found opioid receptors all over your brain, in your gut, in your body. And they, so now the puzzle was somewhat complete. We have endorphins that get released. They activate these receptors. And then the next discoveries and over the next few years is trying to figure out what these receptors are doing. And what was found by John Leibniz and others started to realize that our brain has this elaborate pain control system. It's right in the middle of the brain. It starts in the periaqueductal gray, which is in the middle, goes down the spinal cord, And if opioids are in this system can either inhibit pain, or if other chemicals are in there, it can actually make your pain worse. So we started to understand that pain is not pain. Let me go to next slide. We started to understand it's a more complex process where, yes, you touch something hot, it sends a signal, but that gets changed all the way up until you get to the brain, and gets modified by things such as memories and emotions and stress. So pain is not just pain. And getting back to the 40s, 50s, even before then, that was a big puzzle, because first of all, you'd have soldiers that had terrible injuries but didn't seem like they were in pain. And then there'd be other people, and this was the classic example of women who have what we know now to be fibromyalgia or chronic regional pain syndrome. They hurt, but you couldn't see what was hurting them. So they were just considered crazy. And that is a stigma that was carried by people in pain, and some of that thinking that people in chronic pain are just crazy still lingers in the medical profession today, and that's something we're trying to get past, because we now know that you can hurt without having your foot in a fire or some terrible injury. All right, so here's the brain, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the pain system, how pain works. So pain comes up your spinal cord, assuming it's from your body, as opposed to your face or whatever, but it comes up and then it goes all over your brain. We understand there's a lot of different areas in your brain that make you hurt. Pain's very important to organisms, and a lot of brain structures are devoted to perceiving it, detecting it, responding to it, learning from it, and all that. So pain comes up, but then in normal circumstances, these endorphins are released. Those are little keys in the diagram, which activates descending control, neurons that go down the spinal cord that then stop the signal of pain and hopefully stop the activity of the brain that says you're in pain. It's your own pain relief. That's typically how it works. And that pain going up, causing pain, is how, when you take morphine or Percocet or opioids, that's what you're doing. If you, and this was done research in the 80s, but if animals would have morphine injected right where those little pills are in the brain, you can actually turn on this descending control system by injecting little bits of opioids into the control system. And conversely, if you were to give a person an opioid and they take the pill, if you inject naloxone, which blocks opioids in these areas of the brain, you can actually block the analgesia from it. So we really started to see that there's this elaborate system in the brain that controls pain, that is driven in large part by endorphins. And when you give an opioid, you're basically putting the opioid where the endorphin would be and turning on that system. So you take the pill, it causes descending control, reduces the pain coming in, and reduces the pain. So that's all good. But there's a problem here. And Heidi, just tell me when you think I should stop for questions or whatever. But
I will do. But now I'm like on the edge of my seat.
Okay. Well, the however is when you take a pill, don't fall off, okay? I don't want you to hurt yourself. When you take a pill, you don't get the pills just don't go to one place in the brain. It goes in your blood. If it gets through the blood-brain barrier, it goes all over your body, and it goes all over your brain. And that's the problem. If the pills only went to the place where the endorphins cause pain control, we wouldn't have any problem. We just give opioids for pain, but they go everywhere. So where else do they go? And I'm giving you a simple version of this, and I'm not an addictionologist, but there are two main components to where addiction happens and is controlled. First, you have your prefrontal cortex. It's right behind your eyes and in the front of your brain. That part of your brain is involved with executive function or self-control. It's an area that says stop. It says look at the future. How's this going to impact my family, my friends? And that's a very good thing. That's very involved in people. But there's another area. It's called the reward center of the brain, or the nucleus accumbens. That's where fun happens. So there's a few different analogies for this. If you've ever seen the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other shoulder arguing about something, that's essentially these brain areas arguing. The go area says it's fun. The stop area says, but wait, there's consequences, and you don't want to hurt your children or whatever. So these are in opposition. It's in Freudian theory, it was the id versus superego, and they would argue. Id wants to have fun. Superego saying, look at the greater impact of what you're doing and try to be reasonable. So opioids, if they go to the go center and they go all over the brain, they actually feel good. They activate the area. So does cocaine. Cocaine does it a little differently, but that's where one gets the euphoria from these drugs of abuse. So the go area gets very activated, and over time, the stop area, prefrontal cortex, gets less. It's like a muscle. It gets less used, less active. So this, what I'm showing here, is the essential problem with drug abuse. You basically have a car that has an accelerator pushed all the way down, and your brakes aren't working. And that's where things get very out of control. Okay, so the trick is, how do we, oh, and by the way, if you look at people who have low prefrontal cortex activity, the part that's the self-control executive function, criminals tend to have low prefrontal cortex activity. Kids, their brain's not developed fully until they're about 20, a little later in boys, and their prefrontal cortex is the last to develop, so they don't have great impulse control. And then drug abusers. If you're addicted to drugs, your prefrontal cortex tends to be less active. So you don't have the stops, but you do have the go, and that's essentially the problem. But at this point, I want to be real clear about something, that most people in pain don't become addicted to opioids. They're not taking them like addicts. Addicts take the drugs to get high. They're trying, whereas people in pain take them in a fashion that best treats their pain. They'll take lower doses. They'll not try to get a spike. They won't inject. They won't snort. So most people in pain, even though these systems, both these systems get the opioids, don't get to the point where the go is gigantic, but some do. And the exact number, we're not sure. I've heard wild estimates from almost nobody gets addicted to 40%. It's really probably somewhere around 5 or 10%, but we don't have the best studies to know that. So,
David, I'm going to just stop you right there before we jump into and then please, folks, do send in your questions in that chat box. So the idea, just going back to how you had started this, your part of your opening comments was sometimes, what is the pain we're really treating? And so I'm wondering if you could go back and revisit that moment, the stop-go in the prefrontal area, and why are some people predisposed, perhaps, or I don't know if maybe you're going to get to this later in the presentation, but why is sometimes the person's experience or who they are, or maybe even adverse childhood experience, like how does that roll into that? What role does early trauma or adverse childhood experiences or someone's own experience play in that interaction between the stop and the go?
Right, stop and they go. Well, there's, first of all, opioids aren't as addictive for everybody. Some people have variations in their genes, and opioids aren't that much fun for them, or they're just a little fun. Whereas there's other variation genes where it's a lot of fun. But then you have to look at experiences in general. I mean, there are people before they take opioids that don't have much executive function control, and there are people. So those people might be more prone, if the opioids feel fun to them, to not be able to control themselves when they start. They say, they'll say, oh, oh, that was good, I want more. And that's a problem. And those kind of people, if we can figure out who they are, we need to be careful with opioids for those populations. And that's some of the stuff that we're doing at NIDA, is figuring out who's at more risk for addiction and trying to find ways to treat their pain without causing the ill effects. And ideally, what we come up with, and we've been trying to, through various research efforts to figure out who's more vulnerable, is to figure out who benefit from opioids and make sure that they can get them at the proper amount that helps them, and find out who's going to have problems and make sure they get other sort of treatment for their pain. We don't want it to be that somebody in pain, we just say, well, you're not a good candidate for opioids, therefore you're going to suffer. That's unethical. But we do want to know, just like with any other drug or treatment, who's going to work best for and who's not going to work best for, and get the right treatment to the right people.
That's right. And could you address just the adolescents, because their brains are still developing, why they are particularly vulnerable, and even those that may not be vulnerable later in life are particularly vulnerable as they're growing into adulthood and their brains are maturing.
The brain develops. It develops from the bottom to the top, essentially. And the very last thing to become completely developed is the prefrontal cortex. So they literally don't have as much of the thing that stop. Plus, they don't have as much experience, too. So that figures into it. And over time, I think the prefrontal cortex, with experience, you start to learn that, this is a bad idea. I probably should go to sleep because I'll feel terrible tomorrow. But that takes time to learn, and the structure in the brain that does that takes time to develop. I think males are like 22, 23 before their prefrontal cortex is completely developed.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, so,
right. Well, I know we did read, and we'll get back to that adolescents are initially exposed oftentimes through prescriptions, that dentist prescriptions account for 31% of adolescents' first response to an opioid.
Right. Yeah, and that gets into the whole idea of using opioids smarter and using them not smarter. Yep. Dentists tend to use them because they do like third molar extractions, wisdom teeth, or other procedures. They cause trauma, and after doing that, you want to do something so the person doesn't suffer too much, which is fine. But in a lot of cases with dental procedures, there's a lot of inflammation, and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories tend to work at least as good as opioids, maybe better. So that's something. And then there's the whole post-surgical overprescribing thing, where if you get whatever your surgery, dental or otherwise, too frequently, the patient will get a month's supply when they don't even want any. Right. And that's a lot of opioids out there. Either they don't use them, they're in the medicine cabinet and somebody could divert them, or they think they're supposed to use them and they just take them for a whole month and then they start to have a problem with them, or they already had a problem with addiction and they go back to it. So giving too many opioids post-surgically is a prescription for disaster. Yeah. But,
and a good note for parents to be aware when they're taking their kids having those procedures to say, is that an opioid? Do they need it? Do they need that much? And is there an alternative, like a ibuprofen or something like that? Right. So wonderful.
And that gets back to the whole idea of patient education. The patients, we're trying to get them more aware of what their rights are, what to expect, realistic expectations, and that they have a part in the treatment process. They have a voice in it, and then get clinicians more trained. And I don't know if I'll get to it, but most clinicians get almost no training on pain, and yet that's the most common thing they're taking care of in most clinical settings. So it's a real bad combination.
Yeah. Well, before we go off and start talking about, the nation's issue with scope of pain in the country. Also, do know that NIDA folks has extraordinary resources on their website for all this the consumer facing and consumer protection help, just when you want to understand more about how to actually interact with a physician, or to know more about the brain and the adolescent development. So a lot of that's on NIDA's resources and NIDA for Teens, so commend that to you. But David, why don't you take us forward?
Okay. Just a little bit about how much pain there is in America. This comes from a 2011 report from the Institute of Medicine. About 100 million Americans suffer from pain. And I'm not talking about if you poke yourself with a pin that you hurt. This is pain that is on a regular basis and interferes with their life to some degree. About 25 million Americans suffer from debilitating pain. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people with a disease. A lot of this is a disease. It's not just a sensation. And so it impacts a lot of people in terms of the cost to society, pain in terms, including taxing the medical system, lost wages, and all the other things that drain our economy because of pain. It's about 3/4, 2/3 of a oh, this slide's wrong. Trillion. It's not billion. It's a trillion. I don't know why that's there. I don't know how long I've been saying it that way, but it's almost 2/3 of $1 trillion each year, which is more than we spend on the military each year. I mean, and it dwarfs any other medical condition. I was driving down the road, listening on the radio. They were talking about another medical condition costing. I think they were saying Alzheimer's is the most expensive medical condition, and they said how much it costs per hour. I worked it out. It's about a tenth of what pain costs. So it's expensive in terms of money. It's expensive in terms of human suffering. It's a big problem. So let's just turn to the opioid crisis. Now, all you have to know on here, this is 1999. This is the beginnings of the opioid crisis in the United States. These are deaths rates by county across the United States. Red is bad, blue, purple is good. You see in Appalachia, a few more rural areas, there's some going on, but then it starts to grow. And again, this is very atypical. It's growing in rural areas, but typically when a drug epidemic hits our country, it's usually in the big cities. It comes from ports. But no, this is in rural, less developed areas. Getting worse. 2008, 2011, 14. I mean, it's a real mess, and now it's spread way beyond the rural areas too. Look at overdose death rates. It's just keeps going up. Heidi mentioned something about the number estimated for 2016-17. These numbers are probably going to go a lot higher. In 2015, it kind of soared up to 33,000 or so died from just opioids, but that number might jump by another 10,000 next year. It doesn't show signs of relenting, so it's a big problem. Heroin had been at around 2,000 deaths per year for the longest time. It was just steady. I mean, we weren't having a crisis 10 years ago, but heroin has shot up dramatically, where it was over 10,000 in 2015. So, and that also shows no sign of letting up. And part of the problem is you have people using prescription opioids, but if you go to the street, you get heroin. Heroin is really, really inexpensive. I'm not saying you should go out and buy it because it's a bargain, but you might pay $5 or $10 for heroin, and that's and when prescription opioids gotten through the illicit market, where friends and family are not there, heroin starts to look like a good alternative. A lot of people are moving from prescription opioids to heroin. 4 out of 5 people that start heroin had previously abused prescription opioids. Where if you look the opposite direction, almost nobody goes from heroin to prescription opioids. So the fact that prescription opioids are readily available, they're they're in medicine cabinets, friends and family have them, they're perceived as safe because they're medicine. That's a stepping stone towards heroin, and it's disturbing. Although, and this is my most complicated slide, I'll just gloss over it. It's looking like over the last couple of years, people are starting to go straight to heroin. And I don't know why. I can't explain it, but that also is very troubling because heroin, well, you get heroin, you could have different things in heroin. On the left is a lethal dose of heroin. On the middle is fentanyl. It's a synthetic opioid that's relatively cheap and easy to make. It's being made in Mexico and China. It's easy to import because it's so potent. And what you're looking at here is the lethal dose of fentanyl. It's about 150 to 100 times more potent than heroin. And then carfentanil on the far right, that's used as, it's another opioid. It's used as a elephant tranquilizer. That's the lethal dose of carfentanil. And if you heard in the news reports that people are just handling opioids, like the police touch it and they have an overdose episode, these are probably the drugs that do it, because a little bit getting through your skin can give you an overdose. And hopefully they get resuscitated with naloxone or reversed. But these are really, really strong. And if you're buying heroin, first of all, heroin costs about 10 times as much to make as fentanyl or carfentanil. So there's this motivation for drug dealers to sell fentanyl. It's cheaper. If you mix it with heroin or sell it in a powder and say it's heroin, you don't have much expense to make the drug, but the addict still gets the opioid high. Part of the problem is that you have it takes a little measurement error, and you might be getting a lethal dose, because measuring carfentanil, you need a really, really good scale, and you have to be very, very careful. And I don't think that's always the case. Okay, so this I'm showing you something I think is interesting. This is the increase in death rates from opioids over this period. But over the same time, the number of people in pain doubled, which is weird because pain isn't really contagious. It's not supposed to be, at least. I think I saw one study that suggested it might be. But we have a major health condition that doubled in 15 years. That too should be disturbing, and we need to figure out why pain is increasing so much in America. Part of it is weight, exercise. The population did increase, but that doesn't explain the whole thing. So we need to address both of these crises. They're both very significant on the population, and they're both increasing rapidly. So how do we do that? And this is my simplistic effort to figure out just a general way that we can work on the opioid and pain crisis. And I think the way we got into this mess, undoing those things, is how we get out of it. Right now we have very, very poor clinical training. You go to doctors, you go to nurses, most of them got hardly any training in pain across their whole education. So that's a problem, because they're dealing with opioids. And the other thing they tend not to get trained about is drug abuse. So, and then you're going to them and they don't know whether to prescribe the opioids. They don't know how to treat them. That's a problem. Reimbursement is minimal for things other than opioids. That I think is changing, but in general, it's quick and easy and cheap to prescribe an opioid. And the other thing is this comprehensive pain medicine that involves all sorts of specialists and both pharmacological, non-pharmacological things, exercise, physical therapy, and all the sorts of things, cognitive behavioral therapy, all that cognitive behavioral, it's expensive. And then the poor tools. We don't have that pain treatment that doesn't have bad side effects. It just works for everybody. And certainly opioids carry a lot of baggage, but even things like NSAIDs, ibuprofen, they can cause all sorts of other problems like renal failure. So there's not the magic bullet. So that's something we're working on at the NIH to get better pain treatments. And put these together, it was a very bad combination. And I think we have to work on reversing some of the these things to for the crisis. And this is a paper we put out at the NIH, just talking about how we need to treat pain and we need to fight opioid problems together. It's not, and a lot of the solutions, like better clinician training, will help people with their pain and also help reduce addiction. So, and better treatments for pain will help reduce addiction and help people in pain. It's not we have to solve one problem, but pretty much we see it as a common, bigger problem that we need to take on collectively. Okay, so you want me to take a little break?
Yes, yeah, just a moment. Thank you so much. This is really so illuminating, David. Thank you. I'd like to, as we start to explore what NIDA and perhaps with the National Pain Strategy and all of the research that the agency can be brought to bear, what is the focus on better pain treatment and pain management for those with chronic pain, and how is that being parsed from the opioid epidemic and the issue of misuse and illicit use, and those who require pain management and treatment over time? So I know we've talked about it in our side conversations. I think this would be a really good moment to talk about just the distinctions in those who are suffering with chronic pain and the approaches that the agency is taking.
Okay, that's a big question, but it's certainly let me just distinguish between acute pain and chronic pain. I don't like those terms. There's pain that is because of your nerves firing inappropriately. There's that's called neuropathic pain. There's nociceptive pain, which, say if you break your leg, you've got pain fibers saying you're hurt, and that's just your pain fibers saying you that something's injured, and that's not a disease. That's just normal function. Or some diseases, like gout, for example. If you picture what gout is, it's uric acid that forms these little spikes in your periphery, like your feet. And when you walk along, it's like walking on needles because you literally have needles inside of you. That hurts, but that's just your nerves telling you that you're poking yourself with a pin, okay? So and in those cases, you cure the disease, the pain goes away. And that, we're worried about that sort of pain. It looks like opioids are probably pretty good for what we call acute or nociceptive pain. Maybe okay for some forms when your nerves are firing funny, but then pain can also become a change in your brain, where your brain, and I said that brains before getting all red, but it literally, your brain gets swollen. You got all these chemicals, the chemokines, cytokines, they're all floating around in there, and they can make it, if they get released too much, and there's various things that make these chemicals make your brain inflamed, they make it so that everything hurts. And I've met, I met so many people with these brain disease, pain condition. We call it either central sensitization. I'd like to call it sensitivia, but that's just a made-up word. But their brain is such that something that won't hurt other people hurt them. And one example that really sticks out was this woman, a girl, she was like 20, and her mom was there. We were going to go out to dinner. It was at a conference, and we were going to speak the next day. We're standing, and she looked so frail, but she got hit by, she was standing in a lobby of a hotel, and an air conditioner went on, and just cold air hit her, and she just dropped to the floor. Now, cold air should not be painful. Something is wrong with that person. That's so common that air or water hitting you, just slight touch, hurts to an extreme. And that's a problem with your brain. Your brain is basically amplifying normal sensation, like a touch of a feather. Feels like a knife cutting the person. It takes normal sensation through your touch fibers. It's saying you're being touched, but your brain then says you're being killed, you're being hurt bad. And that's the kind of pain that I think we have to worry the most about. We're okay with acute pain, but people with years of this suffering, first, they're suffering so bad, and second, opioids tend not to work on this sort of pain. but they're used. They're almost, in some cases, throwing fuel on the fire. But this is the kind of pain I think that we are taking on a challenge trying to find cures for chronic pain.
It's always more complicated than we initially think, but I mean, we all know and are in relationship with people who have conditions that because of those conditions then have set off a series of long-term pain, and managing that pain, managing ongoing different mixes of different opioids over time, and managing that is really a great challenge, and I'm glad to hear that NIDA is paying particular attention to that. Right. So, we'll continue on because I know we're moving on in time. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for that, David. What?
Sure. I don't have to say everything. I mean, okay. but some of the efforts we're trying to do, it's the NIH's #1 priority for pain and opioids. But some of the efforts we're trying to put forward and are doing right now to chip away at this problem. One is to get better measures of pain. Good science. If you do science and research, if you don't measure stuff well, what you find in your science isn't good science. It's unreliable. And right now, our gold standard for measuring pain are smiley faces or 0 to 10 scale. And I don't have time to get into how these are inaccurate, but they are, and I think we can do better than measuring with smiley faces. For me, the analogy would be if we were asking somebody what their temperature felt like, and instead of using a thermometer, you'd have them point to various campfires. It's like, how warm do you feel? How cold do you feel? Science would be terrible if say weather people, meteorologists, just stuck their hands out windows, or chemists stick their fingers in liquid to feel how warm it is. You use a thermometer, and so that's why we're arguing, and we're starting. We just finished the solicitation for what we lovingly call the painometer, and what we mean by that. And we just did a business grant solicitation. We've got tons and tons of companies that have these various metrics that could give a better idea of a patient's pain state. You should listen. If somebody comes in and says they got a fever, you say, okay, let me take your temperature. If somebody comes in and says they have pain, you should believe them, but then also have some sort of metrics that give you a little better picture of their pain, some idea of what treatments might work, some idea of the cause of the pain. And this isn't science fiction. We're not going to be able to measure the whole totality of a person's pain, but I think we can improve upon just self-report, which is very unreliable. It varies from subject to subject. You'd say what your worst pain you've ever had. Well, you might not have much pain, or you might have a lot of pain. So I think we can do better with that effort. I mentioned before we clinicians don't get much education in pain. This is a graph. I'm not going to take you through the whole thing. The big thing here, though, is that in the United States, in medical school, the average over 4 years, the average MD to B gets about 9 hours of training on pain. I mean, it's the biggest, costliest condition, and they get like 1 day over 4 years. Canada, it's about 14 hours of training on pain, and still, it's not much. And then you compare that to veterinarians, they get almost 90 hours of pain training. And my vet is really good at taking care of pain. Something's wrong with this picture, and I think it's that the people that take care of people should get more training on pain. So what we've done with this effort is, it's not really a main thing that the NIH does in terms of education, but we are developing centers of excellence in pain education, where all these people you see, they are, well, some of them are actors, some are not, but these are cases that we talk about these people's pain. You get to see videos of them. You get to learn of their problems and how they're being treated, what works and doesn't, and hopefully you learn how to take care of pain better. Instead of providing a curricula where you give a lot of information to MDs or future healthcare providers, and this is for nurses, pharmacists, dentists, MDs, we're showing them people and how these people might present and ways you might want to treat them. So, and they're all interesting. They're have their own little riddle to them. Edna, for example, she has back pain, and her back is all has a lot of arthritis and scoliosis and stuff like that. But it's not her back; it's her hip. And the lesson there is just because you see something that's messed up on the X-ray, it doesn't mean it's the cause of pain. You got to delve deeper. Peter James, he's an actual. He really, it's not his real name, but he is an Afghanistan vet that lost his leg. He has problems with opioids. He's has a problem with pain, post-traumatic stress disorder. So each one of these, Morgan's real cute. She has a little blog. She's 14 years old and dealing with pain from a kid's perspective. So I think that these are part of what we're trying to. These are educational modules and part of a bigger effort to educate clinicians about pain. There's Peter James up close. I won't show the video, but he's very compelling. And you can go to the NIH Pain Consortium site and just do these yourself if you're interested. And then, Heidi, you mentioned the National Pain Strategy. And that's an effort coming out of DHHS where the Pain Consortium was very involved. But we now have a strategy. It's like a cookbook for all these things and all those areas you see on the screen that we can do now, soon, or in the longer future that could help people in pain. And so, for example, under professional education, we have our Centers of Excellence Pain Education. We would put them on steroids, basically get more modules, push them out there, get other materials in, and really create a portal for pain education. There's things on public education. Again, the person in pain, the public needs to be more part of the solution for pain. They need to be stakeholders in that. This in their own suffering and stopping their suffering. So we have these 6 efforts that are on the way. We're trying to figure out how to implement them now, but we're hoping that we do. And with this national pain strategy, I've had people say, well, Dave, why isn't this more anti-opioids? We're in an opioid crisis. And my reaction to that is, look, if we take care of pain better, we're fighting the opioid crisis. So, and then the NIH, that's building 1. The NIH has taken on the opioid crisis and pain as its #1 priority. Francis Collins met with Donald Trump, and President Trump told him, you got to do something about opioids and pain. And that really put us in high gear. And we've been starting a bunch of initiatives trying to make that happen. Here's our website talking about our all-hands-on-deck approach. There's the head of the NIH telling the crowd we have to measure pain better, we have to treat addiction better. So we are moving full speed ahead to fight pain and to fight the opioid crisis. And that was music to my ears when I was afraid the NIH might just take on the opioid crisis and forget about people in pain. And that would be a tragedy because opioids would be less available. People in pain would not get them. They would suffer. They might get them on the street. They might kill themselves. It's not a good scenario. But if we can do that shared solution I was talking about, then I think we help fight both crises. And my last slide before my name comes up and we take a few more questions. This paper just came out this week. It's from the Annals of Internal Medicine. It's gotten a lot of press. Newsweek covered it, CNN, and I think it has an important message. We have an opioid crisis for sure, but we also have a drug abuse crisis. Rates of cocaine abuse have really shot up in the last few years. And so if we just focus on on opioids, and we at NIDA don't, but if we just, as a public, just pay attention to the opioid crisis without some of the other drugs of abuse that are increasing, especially cocaine, I think that's doing a disservice. And what this paper showed, it looked at the rates of death for African American people from cocaine and compared that to opioids in Caucasian or white people, and they found that the rates are about the same. So a lot of black people are dying from cocaine proportionally to the number of white people that are dying to opioids. And we think that we need to take both of these as seriously. I mean, we have to take on the cocaine crisis too. And I would like, this is one attempt to at least show that they're equivalent and to try to bring more attention to beyond just the opioid crisis. This is in no way supposed to diminish the concern about the opioid crisis, but we have to worry about cocaine too. So that's my presentation. I've got like 5 minutes. Questions would be great.
We do have questions. Thank you, David. So I'm going to turn it over to Ben Odell, who's been looking at the questions that came in a little later in the web than we'd hoped, but here they are. Ben?
Yeah, Heidi, Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for the presentation today. I think I would echo everyone who's been joining our call saying how helpful this information is and for providing clarity around something that is, as you noted, such a complex issue. So first, let me ask, going all the way back to earlier in your presentation, you noted, the different brain and how youth can affect and development of the prefrontal cortex can have an impact. What are some other things that people should be aware of that might be something that would make someone susceptible to becoming addicted to prescription pain or an opioid medicine provided? Are there things that people should know about that would make them kind of, so they should be aware, or their family and friends should be aware of the fact that they could potentially become addicted?
Well, certainly part of our message is to educate the public about opioids, try to keep them in a safe place. The medicine cabinet is not a great place to keep opioids. If they're not locked up, you're asking for trouble. And even if it's not your kids or family members, somebody could come over at a party, a dinner, or whatever, and they just go into your bathroom and they steal your opioids. So people are looking for them, and so they need to be treated very, very carefully. And then in terms of parents, I mean, I'm not the big expert on this, but certainly one of the big things that you look for is change in friends, change in behavior and mood and things like that might suggest that your kid might be having problems, especially if they're in a different peer group. So those are things that one can watch for.
Those are good points, Dr. Thomas, but what about before you get the prescription? So we talked about how people, how the brain is still developing can lead to a susceptibility to addiction. Are there other mental health conditions? Are there other physiological conditions that might make someone predisposed to becoming addicted? Or is it individualized? Is it every single person is different, and we don't know whether or not you're going to be susceptible to becoming more susceptible to becoming addicted or not?
Right. I mean, when you're prescribing opioids, the biggest red flag is a previous problem with drug abuse, any sort of drug abuse. So, and what that manifests itself as a prefrontal cortex thing, there is the description of an addictive personality, and I'm not sure how that translates into the whole prefrontal cortex thing. It probably maps on it fairly well. And in general, you have to be careful with kids because not only are their brains less developed, they have growing to do. I mean, the prefrontal cortex is in there, but you have a brain that's vulnerable in general. It's fragile. So, and that's not that. I mean, kids have pain. I showed Morgan with her pain, the video. We have to take pain seriously, but we also have to realize that we're dealing with a young, developing person, and that what impact you have now might last for the rest of their lives. So you have to be more careful, and that's again where education comes in, where you got to know what you're doing a bit better. For me, the analogy is, if I take my car to a mechanic and they don't know how the car works, you got a problem. Well, if you're going to a clinician, they don't know how pain works, they might do something wrong. So, so yeah, part of it is we do have to have better predictors of who's vulnerable, who's not. But we also have, once we get that, we still need the training and better treatments too. I mean, we need everything, and that's why the NIH is taking this on in so many different angles, because there's not one simple solution. The whole system is broke, and we got to start fixing it from every direction.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, Dari asked a question to your point exactly. So if someone has been addicted to in the past, how should they think about pain management in the present? You know, they know that they've had someone who's had a problem with addiction in the past. What are some other alternatives that they should consider to managing their pain if they know that they're susceptible to addiction?
Right, and even with a history of addiction, it doesn't mean that opioids are always
That's a great point.
Counterindicated. In the right way, and you just kind of have to watch more carefully. And there's things you can do when prescribing opioids, like pill counts and contracts and screens and checking how many other prescriptions they might have got. There are things you can be vigilant about and still give opioids. For example, even with a history of drug abuse, if you have a major surgery, you're probably going to need opioids for a few days, then switch to NSAIDs and things like that. But that should be done with an understanding of the history and with great care. Some of the other treatments, I think there's something like 200 pain treatments out there approved by the FDA. The trick is to find the right treatment for the right person and not just go through a whole cascade of experimenting on them. So and that's why we want to measure pain better. So we might have a better idea of, you have this flavor of pain, and in research, these sort of treatments work better, and you want to stay away from those. And to get the right treatment to the right person, so you can minimize their suffering and not use opioids in cases where they'll hurt the person.
That's a great point. Well, let me see if you have, Dr. Thomas, any other final points before we wrap up. Just anything, key things that you want to make sure people are taking away from the webinar today. What's one thing maybe that they should think to take to their doctor, one thing that they should think to take to a family member who's struggling, or if they themselves are, we have many people who participated today who are struggling with chronic pain. What are some key things for each of those three populations to remember?
Right, and one thing that I tried to weave into my talk, I don't think I got it in there much, but the whole idea of stigma. And we've got to get rid of stigma. People in pain, they're often seen as weak or addicts or just drug seeking or just they don't want to work or complainers. We can't. I would love to see people just take pain seriously. And that if you're in pain, it's okay. Let's try to get you help. You should not only get help, you should demand it. And the stigma around drug abuse disease, these people need help too. And the problem with stigma for people in pain or people with addiction problems is you tend to hide. And even family members around people with these problems tend to hide the condition. And to get better, it's best not to hide. It's just not feel bad. It's just the way things are, and it can get better. And to seek and expect good treatment, and not to judge these people because they're just struggling like everyone else.
That's a great point. And so, Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for your presentation today. I think we all really learned a lot and benefited from it. If you today didn't see your question answered, as we tried to get through as many questions as we could, feel free to send those to partnerships@hhs.gov. That's partnerships with an S at hhs.gov, and we'll do our best to get back to as many people as possible. In case you missed it at the top of the hour, today's webinar has been part of a series of educational webinars produced by the Partnership Center over the last year that have been specifically designed to help faith and community leaders understand and address the opioid crisis in the country. We've been enlisting subject matter experts like Dr. Thomas here at HHS, and we talked about opioids, the science of addiction, treatment, and the long road to recovery. And so you may have had some questions that you addressed here today that were addressed by previous webinars. So we encourage you in the email that you'll get to look through and watch some of those previous webinars. If you haven't joined us before, you may see some answers to some questions that you asked today as a part of those webinars talking about some of the other elements of this crisis that we've addressed through other webinars. And so you'll get a link to those in the email that we send out to everyone who participated. That will include a link to a recording of the webinar where you can go back and listen and watch, or you may have had trouble throughout the presentation with audio. Feel free to go back, watch that recording to make sure you catch everything that we talked about today, as well as links to our other educational webinars and the live stream that we did with some of the key experts here at HHS around these topics. Let me turn it back over to Heidi for us to wrap up today.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Dr. Thomas. You really, I have learned a lot. I hope that everyone who's joined us today and those who will listen to the recording and then share with their friends and perhaps their families over the holidays. I know that this is a time when it's perhaps a good opening to have new conversations, especially as we address the stigma and issues of just not knowing and not understanding these very complex issues. So thank you for all the work that you're leading at NIDA and at NIH, and thank every single one of you out there. We are so glad you have joined us today, and stay in touch. All right, friends, have a wonderful afternoon.
And thank you, Heidi. I appreciate it.
You bet. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.